very much, Chris. Hello, everybody. How are you all? Um, I thought tonight that it would be probably good for you to understand the way in which I arrived at the decision to deal with Maritime Buddhism and the process by which I went through in my own research and efforts. So I hope that it's not too personal and boring for you to see the process I went through, but I'd like to share that with you. I'm sorry, Chris, it's not changing slides. Thank you. Well, the person who has influenced me the most from the very beginning was the Indian scholar Himanshu Prabha Ray. Professor Ray began her career by writing about maritime history of India. And then as she worked on the maritime history of India, she began to deal with the role of Buddhism in maritime. I read her work and it inspired me to start thinking about the same thing. So I went to a conference in India and met her in person for the first time. She's a very engaging speaker. We had a really interesting time, or at least I did, talking to her. And as she talked, I became more and more interested in trying to figure out how to answer some of the questions which she was raising regarding Buddhism and maritime activity. I just want to share with you that she is the original thrust that I used in her works in order to do my work. And I really always like to recognize her. At that same conference, I came in contact with an old friend, Professor Dayalan. Some of you have met him if you've been to Ikai meetings. Professor Dayalan was at that time the director of the Archaeological Survey of India for South India, for all of South India, and operated out of Chennai. For those of you who don't know the name change, that used to be called Madras. And after the conference, I went to visit him in Chennai. While I was there, I went down to his office with him, and he pointed to this rack of shelves with folders and said, "These are all the archaeological notes that were taken when the archaeologists explored any site in South India." And I looked at them and opened up a couple and asked him if I could have a chance to read them. And he said, sure. So for almost 3 days, I sat there in his office and read those archaeological notes taken by the archaeologists who were digging where Buddhist artifacts or sites were found. It began to dawn on me as I did so that I needed to pay more attention to exactly where these digs were. And although I didn't know precisely where they were, I had some idea, particularly in terms of they were in Kerala state or Tamil Nadu. And I asked myself the question, it seems to me, said I to myself, that Buddhism was a coastal religion in terms of the fact that that's where I'm finding all of these notes telling me about the location of Buddhist sites. So I talked to Dayalan and I said, is this true? Was it the case that the Buddhist sites cluster at the coastlines? And he said, well, what we've done is many of these sites are not at a named place. They're found out along the coast. They're found in vacant fields. So what we really need to do, he said, was to really, truly geo-register exactly where these sites were. So I had a little research money left over from another grant. I don't think I ever told the grant that I had that money left over. And we used it to send out some of his archaeological students. And we gave them computers, a GPS, and cameras. And they spread out across Tamil Nadu and Kerala state, going to all the sites which the Archaeological Survey of India had noted that they found Buddhist material. At the end of their work, we made maps like the one you see here with the little pink dots on it. That is, we now had a true absolute 6 meters for any Buddhist site. You know, one of the problems with putting a dot on a map, unless you geo-register it with the GPS, is you can be 200 miles off because you put a big dot that's equal to 100 miles on your map, maybe, and you put it on there, and it's just can actually be where the place was, or it can be totally opposite. So when we got back and we started looking at the map, as you can see here, in other words, it's true. The Buddhist sites cluster at the coastline. And we also found out that Buddhist sites cluster at river mouths, and that's where ports were. We could follow some of the sites along the river banks, and we discovered the farther you went from the port, the fewer sites there were. And when you finally reach the place where the rivers are no longer navigable and you have just dirt roads or paved roads, the number of Buddhist sites is even less than you find along the riverbanks. In doing this, I also learned, and have never followed up on it, I would love to someday, and if any of you ever want to do this, please, I'd love to see it. I firmly believe that if you study a river, for the culture, you must study which embankment you're dealing with. With large rivers that are difficult to cross, the culture on one bank, it will be entirely different than the culture on the other bank. One side will be occupied and the other will be very sparsely occupied, perhaps by settlements. And that proved to be the case with Buddhist sites. They tended to be on one bank or another of the rivers. So riverine culture requires nowadays, I think, that we study which embankment we're talking about. By the way, if you have questions, go ahead and ask any time. I, at that time, was teaching at Hong Kong University and also had contact with City University. Hong Kong University had allowed me to come every year for 8 years and teach a course on Buddhism, which I enjoyed a lot. But I became very interested across town in a fantastic new structure at the City University of Hong Kong. The media center had developed and was just opening this brand new building. It's a wonderful building. It wastes a lot of space with all of its narrow things, but it's fantastic to look at. I loved it. The first dean of that new school of media was a professor named Jeffrey Shaw. Now, Jeffrey had for years been an innovative experimenter with basically virtual reality, with the computer image, using art. And when he came to this he became the first dean of the Creative Media Center. And it was supported by a foundation in Hong Kong called the Run Run Shaw, named after a famous movie maker who gave money to the university. And this is where I next came into contact with a technology which I felt opened up a whole new way of thinking for me. In that fantastic building, Jeffrey had constructed a VR animation that was animated, a 3D virtual reality total surround theater using pictures from the Pure Land cave at Dunhuang. So you went into this circular room and it surrounded you, and you could manipulate it as you see the person standing there at a little desk. You could move around, you could go and zoom in, you could look at every image on the wall, you could blow it up until you could see the cracks in the paint at Dunhuang. And then Jeffrey, because he's so creative, he added another dimension. He took some of the images, like there was an image of dancers, and instead of leaving them static in the 3D environment, he animated those images. And he did it by bringing dancers from Beijing who did classical ancient Chinese dance. And using their film, he overlaid it on the actual drawings in the picture that was drawn on the wall at Dunhuang. and made those characters come alive and dance for you. It was a fantastic exhibit, so that I now began to realize the potential. When I looked at that Pure Land Cave VR animation that he had done, I thought, this is how art history is going to be done in the future. We're going to have the ability to give art historians a virtual reality in which they can operate, and they can look at minute detail of any image which is in there. Now, there was another person there who influenced me a lot. That was Sarah Kinderdine. Sarah Kinderdine happens to be the wife of Jeffrey Shaw, and she was a professor at the University of Hong Kong. But at the time when I was there, she got a job, and they decided to have a long-distance marriage where she would be in Sydney at the University of New South Wales, and he would be still at City University in Hong Kong. And the marriage stayed together and worked very well. Sarah is one of the most indefatigable. I mean, she has energy beyond anything that I have ever seen in my life. And Sarah came into my view with the work that she was doing with a special camera. This camera took a 360-degree image, stitched together 1,500 analog pictures. That is, it took a picture and then stitched them together pixel by pixel, so you could not tell a difference where one picture faded into the other. And it made a fantastic image that was 360. Sorry? That was 360 degrees, and with the detail which I have described. Now, later, when we decided that it would be really wonderful to try to put together something which would allow us to have all of this technology and have all the data to create an atlas of maritime Buddhism. How to do it? We approached foundations. Most of them shook their heads in wonder and said, we don't understand exactly what you want to do. And we hoped for one of the Hong Kong foundations. They all turned us down. But Sarah had moved to the University of New South Wales, and this opened up the door to the Australia Research Council. The Australian Research Council is one of the major groups that gives money in Australia for scholars to do research. We weren't sure what would happen because they only fund 5% of the applications they get. They get thousands of applications every year. But we got the grant. And it was amazing to me that they gave us $650,000 to carry out the filming of the Maritime Silk Road, as it was called. I'm forever indebted to Sarah, to Jeffrey, for giving me this early approach. So with this money, now we had to do the filming. And again, it was Sarah who took over the filming. She has an erring eye for the right way to film a site. And Sarah spent 7 months filming for us. We filmed from India, Myanmar, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Cambodia. And we did a few films for Guangzhou in China to finish out for our atlas. However, in the process of doing this, one of the things we ran into is this camera, which you see here, costs almost $1 million. We had access to 2 of them. The company only made 4 before it went bankrupt. Nobody would buy the camera because it was so expensive. So with only 4 cameras, and it required a special film made only in Japan by Fuji, and it had to be developed in Japan by Fuji with special chemicals. So we discovered that Fuji had decided to stop producing the film for the camera because only 4 cameras, it was not enough film being purchased. So we had to go around the world and look for all the film that was left. We found a cache of it in Norway. We found bits of it here and there in a number of sites around the world, and we bought it all. And finally, we had almost 500 rolls of the film, which was the last of the film that worked with this camera. So what was cutting edge technology, in fact, became obsolete as we worked. When Sarah took the photos for our work, we had to fly it as quick as possible to Tokyo to have Fuji develop it. And as we worked, the chemicals that were needed to develop the film were getting older and older. And Fuji refused to make any new chemicals to develop this film. So we were working against time when we were working against a collapse of a form of research that we were using. Well, these dots that you see on this map are where we went, but it is a bit misleading because some of those dots represented hundreds of sites that were located in that region. We went from Gujarat, actually we did some in the Red Sea, Gujarat across to Guangzhou, China in this first filming. We not only filmed at the seaports, but we filmed all the artifacts that had come from those sites in museums. So here you see the National Museum of Sri Lanka, and we made an arrangement to go into the museum and photograph their artifacts that came from seaports in terms of the archaeological collections that are represented in their galleries. And in exchange, we taught their staff to do filming and use of our films so that you could see and have 3D and virtual reality for their collection. Our rule was that we left behind the original of any picture we took with the country that we took it in. We only asked that we have permission to use the film. We left them with all of it. So all of these countries got thousands of photographs taken with this new stuff. And that's, in a way, how we could get permission. It took 2 years just to get the permission from all the governments to take the photographs that we took. Well, one of the cameras which Sarah used was a spherical camera. And the spherical camera allows you to do a much wider and more detailed and dimensional image than you would get with a regular camera. So Sarah is out there taking these pictures. I only joined the photographing for a very short time in Sri Lanka. My wife and I went over to Sri Lanka, and we went with Sarah on her jaunt. At the end of just 10 days, I came home. They put me in the hospital because I had pneumonia. I had been so overtired by how you do it. You can only photograph, if you want really good photographs, you can only do it at dawn when the light is good and at sunset. And we had to work it so we would go to sites, which often were tourist sites, to get there before the crowds came. After you film all day, then you climb into a van and drive all night to the next site. And I don't know how Sarah did it. I mean, that's when I tell you that she's a superwoman. That's all I can say. She did that for 7 months. So the amount of film which we have is in the terabytes of data. And it's all the sites as well as the artifacts which exist. Now, one of our goals that Sarah and I had is we decided we don't want to do this just for scholars. We don't want to just produce a book of pictures, nor do we want to just produce something which will be used by 5 or 6 scholars around the world, which is, a lot of academic work only has an audience of 4 or 5 people. So we decided we wanted to be put to the public. We would like to share this because the idea that Buddhism traveled by the sea rather than by the inland route was so revolutionary in a way that in order for it to become better known, we had to figure out a way to make it public. That was not so easy. When we put together what we thought was a plan for an exhibit that would be open to the public, it turned out that in order to do that display with all the projectors, computers that were necessary to do it, it would cost $1 million plus for a museum to mount such an exhibit. Not every museum in the world, as you might imagine, was interested. However, in Kaohsiung in Taiwan is one of the world's largest and most attended museums. The Foguanshan group of Buddhists in Kaohsiung, this small, out-of-the-way southern Taiwan city, is the site of a 100-acre museum. What you see there in the picture is the museum. The galleries are 8-story pagodas. It covers 100 acres. We went to them and they finally decided to do it. And Jeffrey Shaw went over to Taiwan and worked to put in an exhibit which would allow people who go through the exhibit to see the 3D and also virtual reality of the images which we had taken. It's been very successful. The problem that we faced, and it seemed as if sometimes there were insurmountable problems. One of the problems that we faced is when we had basically spent the $1 million to put in all the exhibit, COVID hit. The museum had to close. So we had something which the public couldn't see because we were all quarantined. Nevertheless, they kept the exhibit up, and by allowing a few people in at a time, the government permitted them to begin to show the exhibit. Well, up to the present time, more than 3 million people have gone through our exhibit. This museum in Kaohsiung has as many visitors per year as the Louvre in Paris. It's one of the most attended museums in the world. The crowds of people that go there. Our exhibit is still there. We're averaging still about 10,000 people a day going through and seeing this exhibit. It's to be there for 5 years and maybe longer. So if you go to Kaohsiung, I really hope that you can have a chance to see what resulted from our idea of making the material public. As we did the work, we made a lot of discoveries. I can't go through all of them, but one particular one I would like to share with you. Avalokiteshvara, a bodhisattva. He was a patron of sailors in Sri Lanka. So when I was in Sri Lanka, they took me to a site where the iron ore of Sri Lanka has a large deposit of iron ore. And one of the ancient seaports that was used for iron ore has a hill nearby. And while we were just before we got there, the local archaeologists had found a plaque on top of that hill that said, Avalokiteshvara looks down on the sailors and protects them. In other words, the sailors who came to this port to get iron ore, which they took long distances and faced all the problems of a world in which you lose your life at sea, they felt they were protected because this famous Avalokiteshvara was looking down on them and protecting them. Now, I published a book of the things that I wrote for the exhibit. It's called The Buddhist Maritime Silk Road. A number of you have, I know, access to that. On the cover, you'll see a golden image of Avalokiteshvara in his form as a male in Sri Lanka. And you will see a white-clothed Guan Yin, who is Avalokiteshvara, as he appears in Guangzhou in China. you could hardly have two more different aspects of Avalokiteshvara. This gold image is a recent archaeological discovery in Sri Lanka, relatively so. They took one tiny little scraping from the image and did a metal analysis. And it turned out that this picture of Avalokiteshvara as the sea god had in it iron from India and lead from the Mediterranean. In other words, the image itself here is a depiction of how trade was being used for the metals that made it up. Now, when Buddhism arrived in Guangzhou, Avalokiteshvara underwent a gender transformation. When he got there, he found that people, when this idea of him as the local people said, oh, we already have an avatar of this Avalokiteshvara. And in our place, he shows himself as Guan Yin. And so we show this on the cover to show that the gender transformation of Avalokiteshvara from a male sea god bodhisattva to a female bodhisattva, a gender transformation, is explained by following how Buddhism moved by sea from India to China. Previously, people tried to explain this gender transformation by looking at the Buddhist texts which came through the Silk Road overland into northern China. But there's never any mention in there that tells you why the gender transformation occurred. It's only when we study it from the sea that we can spot this. So that's why I chose to put it on the front of the book. These two, I think, depict so dramatically one of the aspects of something which happened as Buddhism went along its maritime route into China. So let me open up. I hope that you have questions and we can have a good discussion. This is just a little bit of an indication of how we put together the idea of the atlas, how the atlas material led to a museum exhibit. The next thing that's going to have to happen, and we're trying to figure that out now, is what do you do with thousands of photographs that you have geo-registered, and how do you preserve them? How do you make them available to people? How do you mark them up so people can understand them and make use of the data? And that's the next step for us. So now it's open for our discussion for the day. I have some of the questions which you sent in, but I wish that some of you would verbally voice them right now so that we can all hear and discuss them as questions coming from you.
Reverend Kanjan.
Yes, I wanted to know,
as you geo-registered these different ports and these different aspects, and it's amazing to see how many there are. And I really appreciate the work that you did for that because a lot of times what we saw, what was registered on the inland map of the Silk Road, but now we can see the significant influence of the sea, the maritime aspect. As you see in the creation of these statues, and even as you said, the um, change from in the idea of kanon bosatsu, the change of the types of even the materials that it used obviously are quite different. As you can see, I saw even the materials you had iron ore you were talking about, and then you have the idea of the porcelain statue of China, right? Did you see a lot of variation in like even as you said, across the river could be something totally different. So therefore we have to study specifically that even going, 100 miles or 25 miles from each of these different establishments of Buddhist influence, did you see a significant change in the archaeology? And for instance, perhaps even how do you say, the representation of bodhisattvas, etc., in each of these ports? Um, in your study, that's what I was interested to see. Was there a very wide variation?
Of course, there were variations to be found, but at the same time, what we were trying to look for was to the consistency. How did Buddhism move along these ports? And that meant that if the changes were so great that you wouldn't recognize from one port to another, then it would be very difficult for people to have gone back and traced themselves back to India. Take an image. If you have an image, you have somebody who makes these images. It's not everybody who can make an image, a bronze image. It's a very particular group of trained people, artisans. They know how to do it. So that meant that not only was there the idea being passed along, they had to transport actual people who knew how to make these images in the new place. The artisans were taught how to make a particular kind of image. It was not an artistic idea where an artisan would have their own creativity. They had to reproduce exactly as they had been taught how the drapery falls on the image, how to make the face, how to make the arms, how to make the iconographic forms of the hands. So that meant that because that was such a difficult task to train somebody to really do that, that's one of the things that stayed the same as it moved from place to place, because they had to bring the artisans from the other places to carry out what they wanted to do with these images. So in that sense, Reverend, we can see how continuity exists even though change exists at the same time. Thank you for your question.
So you could see a continuity between them as they influenced each other, is what you're saying.
Yes, so you can look at an image in China and compare it to Amaravati images in India, and you see many of the same folds of drapery or ways in which the image was formed.
Right.
It tells us that not only were there ideas being traveled, and when you explore, these images were being made in their new home. We can check on the ore. We know exactly which ones were made from iron ore from that place. And particularly with ceramics, we know exactly which clay deposit is represented by a shard. We're very lucky that we can do this kind of intense study of any artifact. And one of the greatest discoveries, I think, has been the ability to date the date when a brick was fired.
Mhm.
Once you have that information, it means any brick monument, we now have a way to date when the bricks at least were made, and they were probably made specifically for that structure. So it gives us a range of dates to really understand history from point of view of dating the artifacts.
Thank you. And then later I'll have a follow-up info question about the Lotus Sutra. So
Okay. Anybody else have one of your questions? Well, I'll read one that was turned in earlier. Early Buddhism originated from India subcontinent, was considered foreign, a foreign religion in China. It has been a common understanding that Buddhism arrived in China and set root among the commoners before reaching the Chinese elite. Uh, that's a very difficult thing to say. In part, that's true, but in other words, the merchants themselves brought this material. They brought the artisans. The artisans came and somebody had to pay them. The people who paid were always people with money. It either was the government, the court, the king, the ruler, or wealthy merchants. They had to be the ones to pay to make these things, which were expensive to make. In terms of how people in China began to accept the Buddhist tradition, it happened, I think, both at the same time in a way. One of the things is that it was passed along, and the monks liked to go and have an interview with the officials. They liked to go and visit the king, the emperor. They liked to have an audience. What they wanted was for the emperor to be converted, because if the emperor or the king was converted, then that would be like a mass conversion of everybody else around them. But it is certainly true that there were times when the mercantile class that was seen as low class in China, they were the original ones carrying the Buddhist tradition, and it only came later. In the Han Dynasty, Buddhism had very few supporters from the elite, very few. And it was only when the Northern Way, the Turkic people, came into the Chinese region. Those Turkic rulers found in Buddhism a perfect religion for what they wanted to do. They wanted to make people in that region follow them, become their followers, become their citizens, like the Northern Way. And one way that they did this was to say, we wouldn't be the king if we didn't have good karma. So you're very lucky. You're being ruled by somebody who has really good karma. And so Buddhism was being used by them to give an authentication to their rule. I don't know if you others have a question here with this, what I've been talking about. Okay, let me do another.
Shan, your hand is up.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Okay.
Just Professor mentioned the low class, the merchant. So since last class, I tried to find a lot of books and materials because I mentioned in the traditional Chinese concept, the merchant is in the low class. So it seems for me it's not that difficult, but still a little bit not that much materials to find the merchant society in the Chinese history. But I'm searching now, reading. And just a question coming to my mind, as Professor, you mentioned you have spent 7 months in Sri Lanka and to shooting all those sites. I just because the Maritime Silk Road, it's a road, it's a road for multiple directions. Have you ever found something? Because we see the stages Avalokitesvara as a male image, and to the Guangzhou is a Chinese female image. But have you found that it should be something from Sri Lanka to Guangzhou and something back? So that's the normal merchant behavior. Have you ever found something? Because currently in my research, it seems that it's only one way. I'm not sure whether some from the China, Guangzhou, something, the female Avalokitesvara, for example, image also shown in the Sri Lanka. Because in the museum, it seems that there's always one way direction. You will introduce that it will influence something, but is there anything the merchant would like to take back something from China? That's my question. Have you found that?
By the way, the 7 months was filming all along the maritime route, not just Sri Lanka.
Okay.
That was the whole of our filming. Well, consider this. Buddhism has its origins in India, and it spread soon to Sri Lanka. And as it spread along the Silk Road, around the Maritime Road with the merchants, the homeland of Buddhism was always India. And so there was no group in China that was seen to be the equal of the missionary people coming from India. For a long time, China depended upon them. So the very thought that you could take it back to India didn't really arise until Xuanzang made his famous trip in the 7th century. And he went to India and he went to learn, but when he got there, he was quite stunned to find that the Buddhism which he imagined he would find in India was not what he found. It was a minority tradition. And so he tried to convert the Indians to Mahayana Buddhism. He's one of the few examples we have where a Chinese person went to India and said, it all started here. I'm just bringing this back to you and telling you this is what you ought to believe and have. But in general, that did not happen, as you said. And with good reason, because the centuries of development of the tradition in India could not be equaled by a few mercantile outposts along the maritime route. They didn't have the ability to equal what had been done over the centuries from India, of course. We have this a little bit with the European groups that colonized the world. It was very hard for the colonies to influence, say, London or Belgium or Paris. Very hard. Today, we have a global environment. It's a very different picture now. What we have today is probably what most merchants had in the past who were traveling back and forth between these two places. They must have had a broader view of culture than people who only lived 25 miles from where they were born. So, yeah, it's hard for it to travel both ways. Very difficult. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you.
Let's see, Stephanie, I saw your hand up. Did you have a question?
It was about the museum exhibit, so could come back to that, or if that's okay to ask that now, I can. But I was just wondering how the photos were used, if you could describe that in the exhibit in Taiwan.
Say that again.
How all of those photos were used in the exhibit in Taiwan.
Oh. Well, number one, we created first what's called a half cave, where you stand in a dome, and the images are playing in front of you are from hundreds of images. In the 360-degree room, where people mainly sit on the floor because they get dizzy. But in that room, you're shown hundreds. If you stay there, you can stay there because there's so much data that people only see a small number of our pictures. And yet, if you want to stay and if you want to go back and see it, when it's showing a different way of looking at every single place we visited. People who go through the exhibit, though, do see hundreds of images, hundreds. They're playing for them in what's like a video. And we have another wonderful little thing where you pull a TV screen along a bar and it changes according to the map. So when you come across to Myanmar, then suddenly the images on the screen are all from Myanmar. You keep moving and they're all from Thailand. Problem is to keep the kids away from it who want to make it go fast. And then we also have trouble with adults who make it go too slow. And so sometimes the docents go up and say, move it a little faster because there are people waiting to have this opportunity.
Thank you.
Sure.
Alex, please.
Hey, I want to elaborate a little bit on what Professor Lancaster said in response to Shan Chan's question about bringing back. I feel the direction was that the silk and the porcelain produced in China is the main thing that went back to India and more so Rome, Roman Empire, and the Middle East, Persia, Iraq, and so on. They were the wealthy civilizations at that time. And the Chinese silk and porcelain was extremely valuable. They were not able to produce it, and China was able to produce in huge amounts. So these ships were coming from, originally probably from Iraq, Syria area, Iran, and maybe there will be some exchange in India, and then to China to collect and pay for. They were bringing gold with them. They may have been bringing a few things like glass that China didn't have, and they were paying large amounts of gold and silver for these things and bringing them back. And it was a really huge business. And I think China was a massive manufacturing center, as it is today, still a manufacturing center. It was a huge exporter. of these materials. And the point I wanted to ask Lou about, hopefully, I don't know if Lou wants to say anything, Professor Lancaster wants to say anything on that point, but at some point in the early days, we talked about the Silk Road, where silk was being transported over the through Western China and Persia to Rome. But camels couldn't carry a lot of silk. When it changed to the sea, the maritime route, a boat, one of these ships, even an ancient ship, could carry many tons of silk and porcelain.
Yes.
Many tons, 10 tons, 100 tons is not that big of an amount, but it's very difficult to load 100 tons on a pack of camels.
It is.
It's too much. So I actually, my question for Professor Lancaster is, at some point there was a switch between the Silk Road and the Maritime Silk Road, but where was that switch? Was there some pivot where it pivoted? Is there a pivot on the Chinese side and the Persian or Indian side? Or did it just reroute everything and then take a totally different route?
Well, we know what was happening when we read some of the pilgrims' accounts. Those were the people who actually were traveling along the route through Inner Asia. And they began to report to us how, number one, from the very beginning, it was quite difficult to go through the Taklamakan region because you have such a dry desert and high mountains and all of those problems they faced. But then they began to face Islam. They began to face people who were coming in and taking over the trade away from any of the locals. And as the sea trade really developed, I think it was hard to talk people into sending stuff along the old route because it still could trickle along, but as you've said, it's quite true. You could not have the amount of silk and other goods coming out of China without the ships. Impossible. It would take a caravan 1,000 miles long to carry what you put on a ship practically. So by the time the pilgrims began to travel by ship, that tells us that people in Asia now knew that that's the way to travel. Now, some people travel both ways. And even in the 8th century, Ho traveled from Korea to India by sea, but he came back to Beijing by land and had a hard time of it, but he managed to get back to Beijing. We never knew about him until they found a copy. Somebody made a copy of his diary and put it at Dunhuang in the cave with all the manuscripts that were sealed in a cave around 1000 and finally opened up in about 1908. Among those manuscripts, we found his diary, and it tells us of somebody who did the trip and made the journey both ways. So he knew how to do it both ways. Still in the 8th century, it was possible. We had another great discovery in Denmark. They discovered a manifest written on palm leaf for one of the ships that sailed from the coast of India to Alexandria. And it's estimated that what was on that ship would have taken 1,000 camels to carry. And we know that it got there. And what's amazing about that document is it shows that the sea trade had to develop international banking. People had to trust that they could send money, gold, and lo and behold, a shipload of stuff would appear for them. But in that document, it says, I will deliver this to you at the Red Sea port. I will transport it across to the Nile River. I will float it down the Nile River to Alexandria, at which point you will give me the gold. If you don't, I will take the entire shipment and keep it. And yet people were operating in faith that there would be payment at the other end. And that says a lot about contact between people, that you could trust that you could do such a thing as that. But once the sea trade is fully established, the land route of the past with animals to carry it just couldn't compete. They couldn't compete because just the time it took for a camel to carry something many miles meant that every night you have to stop and let the camel rest. And once in a while, you have to stop for several days and let the camel graze and eat grass to keep up their energy. Can you imagine what it would be like to try to take a single camel journey all the way from China to the Mediterranean? The cost of maintaining the animal for that period of time and the time it would take. So that's why we have to look to the sea and to see that it really did make people rich. So sea merchants had a lot of money. And that's why Buddhism in some places really developed art and other materials in the ports, because the merchants made money. They really could make a lot of money if a shipload of stuff, they mark it up. So somebody in Europe tried to figure out how much gold would be needed for a shipload of material coming from Asia, and they figured that one ship would take 27 pounds of gold. That's quite a lot of gold to pay for what was on a ship. Thanks. Good comments.
Howie, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I was just trying to give a comment, which is Lou already, elaborated on that a little bit more. But I still want to emphasize that even within today's information, it's still incomplete. So we cannot just look at informations already well available or easily available to us to look at, many of the questions. For example, when we are talking about the Maritime Buddhism, just in China, for example, in the Chinese coast area, it's not because there's no evidence there. It's just haven't been either the evidence already there, but never make the connection to, Buddhism spreading or the maritime trade of those kind of thing, especially the archaeology evidence. Usually they even maritime type, they sink into the water, so it's not like a land. Many of the artifact, it's still difficult to discover, but it's even more difficult to discover. So nowadays there's a many new discovery. Still, it's only within different disciplines of discover. It's but it's up to us to like last time, detective work, to make the connection, to find deeper, what's the connection between the raw material to the hypothesis or the theory we are developing, or the ideas that we're developing. So that's the point I try to just give the class. So don't box our thinking too much. Yeah.
Thank you, Howie. Yes, you're quite right. So maybe I look at one of your questions you've turned in. One of the questions is, are these merchants faithful Buddhists? I'm curious to understand if their faith plays any role in the spread of Buddhism. It's really important to understand with the ships. Number one, the ship had an owner. The ship owners were usually from the West. They had a crew. The crew was hired by the ship owner to run the ship and to sail it. They were Arabs, many of them. They were from Egypt, Arabia. They were not Buddhist. And it had passengers. Not only did they have cargo on these ships, but they had room for passengers. The ships played a double role. None of these ships were ocean liners just for people. They were primarily for the transport of the goods themselves. But in doing that, they carried with them passengers. The passengers were mainly merchants. People didn't travel internationally for fun. There was not that idea of tourism yet developed. If you want to do an interesting study of how did tourism come to be, how did it come that we travel long distances from country to country just for the fun of it? That would never have entered the minds of the people at those early dates, because traveling by sea was dangerous. And they had, particularly in the Bay of Bengal, where you have hurricanes during the hurricane season, one hurricane after another. And the ships, if we can ever develop the technology to look on the floor of the sea, we're going to find hundreds and hundreds of shipwrecks, or the remains of shipwrecks down there. It was very dangerous. And there were pirates. That is, when ships passed the same place many times, some of the local people got the idea there's a gold mine passing right by us. If we get on board, we can take over. So merchants not only traveled, they also traveled with the guard. Our guards, they had to be guarded because they had money, they had gold, and everybody knew it. So they would be just ripe for people to rob them and throw them overboard, and that would be it. So they had to protect themselves. So no, people didn't travel for fun. It was serious business, but profitable. If you did it, you could make a lot of money. Thank you. Well, let me try one of the other questions that were sent in. It is well known that merchants involved were mostly wealthy, and merchants at the Yellow Sea who traded with Shandong, the trade was with high-ranking officials in both the Korean Peninsula and the Shandong Peninsula, and that the role of the lower classes during the process should be considered, but how do we deal with other than these very wealthy merchants who were supporting the transport? Because we don't have written records of what ordinary people do. Ancient historians were not interested. They never tell us very much about ordinary people. They just tell us about the officials. And once in a while, they tell you a little bit about a merchant, but as you found, I'm sure, not often. So as you try to construct your merchant persona, I'm sure you realize you are having to make a lot of inferences from whatever data you can find as to what that merchant was like. So the tradition of trade, which was a very highly profitable thing if it worked, European histories are filled with the fact that people were waiting to see if their ship would come in. And people, the idea that we use in a kind of slang expression, has your ship come in, was just what people were doing. They were waiting at the harbor, hoping that the money they had put to buy silk, which was out there on a ship somewhere, that ship would actually make it to port. If it did, they were rich. If it didn't, they were bankrupt. So people were facing some of these really severe issues with regard to how you ship goods by sea, long distance, and actually how do you develop trust? How do you develop protection? What resources do you have to make sure that your ship comes in? Thanks. Let's see. We've got time for one more question from you or comments.
Kanjin, please.
Yes, thank you for the last question. So I had been engaged in a lot of my university. I don't know if you're familiar with Disho University in Tokyo. Um, they focused very much on the inland aspect of the Silk Road and the how do you say, the creation of the Lotus Sutra, which we know,
Yeah.
so lots of people have the theory of that it's a creation of the Silk Road, and even as a kind of reformation of Buddhism to an original, maybe earlier style of Buddhism, etc. Um, and as you were mentioning, the idea of kanon, which is of course an, how do you say, an inserted aspect of the Lotus Sutra in one of the later chapters, 25. Um, did you, because I'm very interested in, for the idea of this, not only cultural, but the idea of the influence of Buddhism and the idea of sutra or literature as that was being transported. And, the Lotus Sutra is seen as this kind of creation and very big aspect of the Silk Road. How does that relate to the idea of in maritime Buddhism? I was wondering if you had put that in any of your research.
Oh yeah, I'm very interested in it. It's a hard topic. It's got a lot of difficulties in terms of the way to study it. First of all, um, particularly Mahayana Buddhism really did develop as a writing religion. It wasn't dependent upon monks chanting the text. It glorified writing. It said writing one 5-line verse gives you more merit than building 1,000 stupas to put the relics of the Buddha in. So they glorified language. They glorified written word. The written word becomes sacred. And that idea of getting people to copy, the more copies you have, the better chance you have of surviving. We still have that idea. If you want to keep something which is presently in digital format, how do you do that? Because digital is so fragile. Every time a computer goes down, a lot of data is lost. And so the idea is, well, just like the old days, the more copies you can encourage people to make, the better chance of that the texts themselves will survive. So they really pushed people to copy. And without writing, I don't see how Mahayana Buddhism could have been spread. There simply were not that many Mahayana monks in India, number one. As Xuanzang found out, they were a minority. And many of them were only partially Mahayanist. They lived in a Mahayana monastery, but they may have had a Sarvastivada belief pattern. So the Buddhism that spread had to make sure it created copies and made sure that people would preserve whatever form they found in written form. And I think that worked. People really prized a written manuscript, and people would pay a lot of money to have one. So in that sense, I can see how Buddhism, as it traveled along the maritime or even the Silk Road point of view, the written form was being glorified. And that's why I think you find in China that the Buddhism, which finally would dominate there, was a marginal form of Buddhism in India. The Mahayana tradition would dominate in China, and China would become, as it is today, still the major home for Buddhist followers. China has more Buddhists than probably the rest of the world put together, still. And so Buddhism has always been very dependent upon China for its creation, its continuation, and its support. Chris, I turn it back to you. Our time is.
Thank you, Dr. Lancaster. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us tonight. And if you have any questions regarding assignments, Moodle, anything else, please get a hold of me, and feel free to stay on for a couple minutes if I can answer any of those lingering questions. See you next week. Have a good night.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lancaster. Good night.
Good night. Good night. See you all. Bye-bye.